Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. We are following breaking news right now. Nathan Wade has resigned as a special prosecutor in the election interference case coming out of Georgia. That one, as you know, involving former President Donald Trump. Earlier today, Fulton Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee decided today that there was, quote, no actual conflict stemming from the romantic relationship between Willis and Wade, the attorney general. But he did say that, quote, the appearance of impropriety should result in either DA Fani Willis or Wade leaving the case. Trump and more than a dozen others are facing charges in Georgia tied to alleged attempts to overthrow the 2020 presidential election. The former president has, for his part, denied any wrongdoing. We want to go now to CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion. She is there in Atlanta. She has been covering all of this for us. So, Nikole, what is the latest that you're learning?
Well, as you just mentioned, the special prosecutor Nathan Wade has offered his resignation to District Attorney Fani Willis. He writes in his letter today that his resignation will be effective immediately as special prosecutor for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. He also goes on to say that although the court found that the defendants failed to meet their burden of proving that the district attorney acquired an actual conflict of interest, I am offering my resignation in the interest of democracy and dedication to the American public and to move this case forward as quickly as possible. As you know, this comes after Fulton County Judge Scott McAfee issued a ruling earlier today that did not disqualify the district attorney from continuing on this 2020 election interference case involving the former president. But he did make clear that she needed to make a decision. Either she could step aside from this case or Nathan Wade should withdraw. And so with his resignation now, that kind of gives us a sense of which way things are likely to move forward if Willis continues to stay on this case. What McAfee found is that, again, there was no conflict of interest, but just the appearance of that impropriety merited that decision to be made in order for the prosecution of this 2020 election interference case to move forward. So again, Nathan Wade now tendering his resignation after about 2 years on the job prosecuting this case against the former president. Lana.
And from Trump's lead attorney, he says that he does not believe that the court afforded, quote, appropriate significance to the prosecutorial misconduct of Willis and Wade. He also said that he and his team will continue to use all legal options available to them to fight this case. But, Nikole, if you could help just reset the stage for our viewers, remind us where these allegations of impropriety stemmed from and what Willis and Wade had to say about that.
Well, again, this all emerged and really snowballed at the beginning of this year when there was a complaint filed by one of the co-defendants in the 2020 case, Michael Roman, who is a former Trump campaign operative, who alleged that this relationship between Nathan Wade and District Attorney Fani Willis was improper. He suggested, and his attorney also suggested, that Willis may have financially benefited from this relationship with Nathan Wade from the standpoint that the pair did take a number of trips together to the Caribbean, to the California, where Wade at times did pay for the trips or the tickets, the plane tickets, cruise tickets. And so what we heard as a result in an evidentiary hearing that was held last month, which was ordered by Judge McAfee to flush this complaint out, is that both Willis and Wade said that the district attorney reimbursed Nathan Wade for those trips, and that she did not see these trips as gifts because, keep in mind, she is the one who hired Nathan Wade to join her team, so he was being paid from her office, which is taxpayer money, and so that was the concern about any potential financial impropriety. But what Judge McAfee ruled today is that he did not find any evidence that there was some scheme on the part of the district attorney to financially enrich herself, and furthermore, there really was no proof of any kind of financial benefit that she may have received. Again, although there may have been that appearance of impropriety, there wasn't enough evidence at the end of the day to prove that distinct conflict of interest. So that is kind of what brings us to this moment with respect to Nathan Wade and why he ultimately made this decision today to step down.
All right, Nikole, if you're thinking of this as a three-ring circus, one of those performances, one of those moments of drama has now concluded, but there is still a long campaign ahead. CBS News campaign reporter and attorney Katrina Kaufman has been following the case. She's given that she has her experience as an attorney. Katrina, I want to just start off by asking you, how much of a setback is this potentially for the prosecution?
I think in a lot of ways this is a win for the prosecution because the case can move forward, but they have lost quite a bit of time during this process. There were a number of hearings, and they will have to make up for that time moving forward. But Fani Willis is able to remain on the case with the rest of her team, and this case is going to stay intact. They will need to find someone to replace Nathan Wade, but it can move forward.
All right, and Katrina, talk to us about how big of a deal it is, really, to be losing the lead prosecutor in such a high-profile case.
Wade played a significant role, and Willis, in her letter, the letter of resignation, her response, she really is very laudatory about Wade, about his role in this process, and about how he took on a job that many people did not want to take. There are threats to your life and the safety of you and your family when you're in a role like this. So it's going to be difficult to fill those shoes.
All right, Katrina Kaufman, thank you. We're going to bring in now CBS News investigative producer Dan Kleiman. He is here with us in Studio 57. He's been following all of this. Dan, the question after we heard the judge's ruling this morning was, who is it going to ultimately be? Was it going to be Fani Willis, or was it going to be Nathan Wade that would step aside? What do you make of the news that Nathan Wade is the one who's going to leave this case?
Look, I think this was a sort of a split the baby kind of Solomonic decision that the judge made, and I think it was quite skillful. He could not disqualify Nathan Wade without disqualifying Fani Willis. There's just no basis in the law that would allow him to do that. This way, with this decision, he can start the process of restoring confidence, public confidence to this case, and I think that's probably part of what he wanted to do. I think the letter in accepting Nathan Wade's resignation from Fani Willis was interesting, and it's sort of what I expected. I was told by a close friend of hers that what she wanted was to make sure that she could preserve his dignity and do it in a way so that he could walk out with holding his head high. So, as Katrina said, she praised him for taking on this case in the face of all of these likely threats, and these threats did come, and they rained down on him significantly, but also the attacks on him and his reputation as a lawyer. And I think she felt it was very important personally to her to defend him, and I think that's what she tried to do.
But on the point of attacks on a personal reputation or professional reputation, obviously Fani Willis herself has faced more than one would expect in terms of arrows coming her way. In a case that was supposed to be focused on President Trump and his co-defendants, it then became focused on her and her romantic relationships. How able is she to continue overseeing the prosecution?
It's a great question. Look, I think she can continue to oversee the prosecution. She's the best lawyer in that office and has the most experience with these kinds of complex felony cases and RICO cases. The question really is the extent to which she can rehabilitate her reputation after all of these attacks on her and, we should say, unforced errors. And I think the way that she is going to do it is not by going out and giving a lot of television interviews and posing for magazines. I think what she's going to do is rehabilitate her reputation in the courtroom. My expectation is that we will see Fani Willis, in a sense, leading not just the overseeing the overall prosecution. I think we're going to see her trying this case in significant ways.
Okay. All right, Dan, want to thank you. Don't go away just yet because we're still going to follow all the machinations of this. I want to go back over to Nikole Killion. Nikole, I understand that perhaps you have some additional information for us, and I'm hoping that you can also put things into context. You know, when we were talking about that three-ring circus, we have the election interference case, we have this question about impropriety among the prosecutorial team, but we also have the 2024 election. How is all of that playing in?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to watch. I mean, as you know, just this past week, Georgia held its presidential primary where, we saw essentially the race get defined with both former President Donald Trump emerging as a presumptive nominee and President Biden emerging as the presumptive nominee for his party. So this race, this rematch, more or less, is on. And, right now, the former president is actually leading here in Georgia, not only according to our polling, but according to multiple polls. So even as this case continues to play out, what impact it could have politically on the former president remains to be seen. But currently, his numbers have gone up in this state. Of course, it was very notable back in 2020 when this state flipped in President Biden's favor. That's kind of what brought this whole case on, right? Because you had the former president calling Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger asking, how can this be? Find me the votes. And so we know that this will be a very critical battleground state going forward with either candidate really potentially, standing to benefit from the electoral votes in this state. So that being said, I expect a pretty fierce competition politically. But again, given what we saw today, how long this case potentially drags out. Many experts I talked to say at this point, the way things are going, they don't expect this case potentially to go to trial before the 2024 election, that would be very ambitious at this point. We know the district attorney initially wanted to prosecute this case in August of this year, but no ruling has been made, in part because this issue surrounding her relationship with Nathan Wade had to be worked out. So the longer this drags on, obviously, it'll be interesting to see whether it has any impact on public opinion, particularly if it's not necessarily in the headlines as much, or if the case doesn't go to trial before the election.
And as you said, Nikole, the former president's support there continues to rise. And we know from our own CBS News polling that his supporters say overwhelmingly that even if he was convicted, they still think that he is fit to serve in the role of presidency. All right. Thank you so much, Nikole. I'm going to go now to CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, we have been speaking ad nauseum about this case, about not only whether there were actual improprieties on the prosecutorial team, but also just that perception of impropriety and how that potentially impacts the case. We heard from Dan that the judge in issuing the ruling figured out a way to say both you shouldn't have done it that way, but it doesn't disqualify you, but something's got to give. What do you make of Nathan Wade now saying he's stepping down?
He had to. There was no way that it was going to be the elected district attorney of Fulton County, Fani Willis, who was going to step down. After this decision came out, it was always going to be Nathan Wade. I did not expect that it would be today, in the sense that I thought they might wait a moment to see whether or not the appeals process would play out. But let's be honest, there's no way that when you think about if it has to be one of them, that it was ever going to be Nathan Wade. And I think that Judge McAfee obviously knew that. I think, will it cause a delay? I think it could cause a delay, but much less than, if not just Fani Willis, but the entire district attorney's office was disqualified from this case. And so the question, and Nikole laid this out very well, the question is, does the trial happen before the election? And I think that is in serious question. And it, of course, depends on the other dominoes. It depends on what is going to happen in the other cases.
So Fani Willis continues to be in charge of the shop, but they're going to have a new lead prosecutor now with Nathan Wade leaving. How much does that set back the prosecution's strategy, and how much does even still these whispers of impropriety continue to haunt the legitimacy of their case?
So in terms of how much does this set back? Well, one would hope that they would have been preparing for this already, in the sense that this was not a surprise ruling. I think this is a ruling and an outcome that, frankly, we should have expected. And so one would hope that even though Nathan Wade had a number of opportunities to step down, that the possibility that a ruling like this would come out was looming large, and that they have made certain preparations for that. One thing I think most attorneys know is none of us are irreplaceable, and we are fungible. And it doesn't mean that there aren't degrees of lawyering, but it means that Nathan Wade, like the rest of us, can be replaced. Now, I'm answering this question in the sense of I don't know whether or not the DA's office has prepared for somebody to get up to speed or if they need to do that. In terms of the second part of your question, the kind of, as Judge McAfee says, the odor of mendacity that can loom over this case, I think this is where jury selection will be so important. And jury selection was always going to be important in this case. Again, let's think about finding a juror that's never heard of and doesn't have an impression of the former president. That's impossible.
Right.
Now we have an additional layer, which is ensuring that the jury can look not at Fani Willis and what they think of her, and not at the former president and what they personally think of him, but on the specific facts alleged and the applicable law here. And again, this whole idea of the jury can't make a decision without looking at the legitimacy of Fani Willis, that's why Judge McAfee said there's an apparent conflict of interest here.
It is a tall order. Dan is here, and he's eager to jump into this conversation. I can see.
I wanted to first agree with Jessica. There's no question that they were prepared for this moment. I think there was even consideration of letting Nathan Wade go before.
Well, people were calling.
People were calling
allies
for it.
Of, I think the district attorney were calling.
I think interestingly, whether intentional or not, this worked out well for the district attorney's office because it gave Judge McAfee a kind of off-ramp. It gave him a way to come up with a judicious decision here. And that also probably gave him a little bit of political cover. But I will say, in terms of the challenges...
So wait, just on that, you think that it was strategically better to have this all play out rather than just have Nathan Wade resign without a decision?
If Nathan Wade had resigned before the evidentiary hearings, for example, the judge wouldn't have had this option, right? And he might have been forced in that sense to disqualify Fani Willis. We can't know for sure, but this was helpful to him and therefore helpful to the district attorney's office. The other thing I'll say is that I don't think there are huge challenges for the DA's office to find someone to replace Nathan Wade. The reason I say that is because his major part of the case is really already complete. It was interesting to note in Fani Willis's letter accepting his resignation that she pointed out that he led the grand jury process. That's really a lot of what he did. He also was an organizer and he was a manager of the lawyers on the team. We're moving into the trial phase of the case. That's not what he's going to do or would have done. Okay. And so I think we may find a leader of the case who either is already on the team or perhaps they'll elevate someone from in the office, or maybe they'll bring another special counsel in. That's a possibility as well. I don't think it's a huge challenge. I don't think it will represent a big delay.
That is really interesting, given that Nathan Wade was not Willis's first choice for the lead attorney on that. Katrina, we're going to go back over to you for a final word. You're following both the Trump campaign as well as the multitude of trials that are trailing him. How much does this decision impact the Trump campaign?
That's a great question. I mean, the truth is that the majority of Trump supporters in Georgia say that they would still find him fit to serve, even if he was convicted of trying to overturn the 2020 election in the state. And also, his side has really been still spinning this opinion as a win for them, because even though either Willis or Wade were asked to step down and it would allow the case to move forward, there was a lot of condemnation of this behavior in the judge's opinion.
All right, big news today. Nathan Wade stepping down as a special prosecutor in the Georgia election interference case. We want to thank all of our guests, Nikole Killion, Katrina Kaufman, Dan Kleiman, and Jessica Levinson. Thank you.